Well, good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many of you here, a full house just about, and a wonderful panel to look forward to this evening. My name is Professor Kerry Lee Krause. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at Trobe University, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's Bold Thinking event. Before we go any further, though, I'd like to recognise that we are meeting this evening on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who might be with us in the audience this evening. Well, tonight promises to be an interesting conversation on what, if anything, should remain off limits in children's books. I'm going to introduce you to our panel members and our facilitator in just a moment, but let me first make a few opening remarks about tonight's topic. International scholars like Peter Hunt have long written about the enduring value of children's books, not just in terms of the way in which they spark our imagination and impart lessons, but also for the fact that they shape how children come to understand the world. B.J. Epstein writes about how we often underestimate children's capacity to understand complexity. She argues that children, like adults, have the right to see books that reflect the world around them. She believes that books should feature different races, cultures, genders, sexual orientations, religions, abilities, classes, ages, and much more. They should also, importantly, explore political, moral, physical, and emotional issues. Australian scholars such as Claire Bradford and Kerry Milan have focused on some of the more controversial aspects of children's literature, such as its capacity to influence how young minds view everything from Aboriginality to gender and sexuality. Books have also become a historical record of how attitudes and beliefs have changed over the ages. And I can just imagine that most, if not all of you, are here because of your love of books, not only what they contain, but the history that they represent. But without further ado, let me introduce to you these specialists on stage for tonight's panel. First of all, on your far left, I'd like to welcome the internationally celebrated Australian Children's Laureate, Maurice Gleitzman, whose books explore serious and sometimes very confronting subjects in funny and unexpected ways. He's well known for his Once series about Felix, a Jewish boy struggling to survive during the Holocaust. He gained recognition back in 1990 for sparking interest in AIDS through his controversial novel entitled 2 Weeks with the Queen. He has won numerous awards, and just one includes the Children's Book Council of the Year Award in 2016 for Soon. Importantly, among all these accolades, Maurice is known for writing books that have, I think, among the most creative titles one could ever imagine. These include, for those who are not aware, and even if you are, it's always nice to be reminded, Aristotle's Nostril, Give Peas a Chance, Toad Rage, and my personal favourite, Bumface. We'll be hearing more from Maurice in just a moment. Joining him, however, and to his left and your right, is our very own Professor Jo Lampert from La Trobe's School of Education. Jo has published widely on her area of research children's books relating to the 9/11 attacks and the aftermath of that. She's also written on picture books about child sexual abuse, and currently she provides very important strategic leadership at La Trobe University in the area of teacher education for disadvantaged communities. Very proud to have Jo join us tonight. And importantly, on your far right, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Dr Juliet O'Conor, who is the Children's Research Librarian right here at the State Library of Victoria. I told her I thought that was one of the best jobs in the world. That's why she's smiling. Juliet is responsible for a collection of over 100,000 children's books published between the 16th and 21st century. A stellar lineup, I think you'll agree, and equally stellar, the very well-known broadcaster and journalist Francis Leach will lead and facilitate our discussion. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for coming here tonight. Before we get underway, I need to let you know that tonight is being recorded by ABC Radio National's Big Ideas program, which is going to be available and broadcast in a time to be determined and put up for podcast, so you can be able to hear yourself in that as well. The recording is going to include the Q&A session at the end of our conversation. So the way that the Bold Thinking series events work, we'll speak for around an hour, and then we'll throw the floor open to you to ask questions. If you are enjoying the conversation tonight and you want to share it via your social media platforms, the hashtag is hashtag BoldLTU, bold all in lowercase, capital LTU. So that's the way you can let other people know about what's happening in here tonight. But I want to start by asking Morris, as someone who's written so many wonderful children's books, there must have been a touchstone text when you were a kid that turned you on to reading, that stayed with you. What was the book in your childhood that had the deepest and most long-lasting impact on you? And do you remember when you first read it?
Well, it was an author who wrote many books. Her name was Richmal Crompton. She was the principal of a very exclusive girls' school in South London, Twin Set and Pearls, and a lot of discipline from Richmal. But each evening and weekend, she would go home and, in her imagination, turn herself into the naughtiest, most creative thinking equipped, the most adult, dismaying 10-year-old boy on the planet. And she wrote, I think about 34 or 35 volumes of short stories about William Brown, the Just William stories. And I was lucky enough to stumble on them in my local public library when I was about 7. And I can remember reading the first one and being aware that the language, the typeface, even the illustrations looked to me to be a bit old-fashioned, and I didn't think of that after the second page ever again through 37 volumes, because the stories were wonderful, and they were not only the most enjoyable and thought-provoking stories I'd ever read, but I think the seeds were sown there of me wanting to have individuals in my life like William Brown, and when I'd read all the books about 3 times, I'd sort of run out, so it was time to start writing my own stories.
So have you thought about the magic of why that captured you so intensely at the time? What was it about that you've now translated into your own writing?
It was to have encapsulated in one character a big, generous heart and the capacity to transgress in any situation that he thought would help improve his life and the lives of the people he loved, regardless of the chaos, the mess, and the social disapproval. That was a philosophy of life for me that I adopted there at 7 years of age.
You found your vocation very early on. You're very lucky. Juliet, just on that, I mean, the idea of kids reading for pleasure, like Morris did in that circumstance, as an act of pleasure, an act of exploration, rather than it being purely perfunctory and educational. When did that start to emerge in literature for kids?
Yeah, I think there was a real watershed in the middle of the 19th century with the Alice books, Lewis Carroll's Alice books, so 1865 and 72 for Looking Glass. And from there, an expansion of imaginary books for children really kind of took effect worldwide. So before that, a lot of the material was quite didactic, quite primarily educational. Certainly in the 16th and 17th century, books for children were very serious, and the notion of a book for entertainment for children was an impossibility at the time. In fact, illustrations were seen to divert children from the seriousness of reading.
And Joan, I'd imagine that coincides with the whole notion of childhood as a concept. I mean, if you think of the Victorian industrial era, and there was no childhood, depending on what class you were born into, you went from being an infant to going to work as soon as you could, and the idea of having time to explore the imagination as a child is a relatively recent product of affluence, is it not?
Well, it is, and I think in the spirit of this conversation, I'm reminded of Judy Blume's books in the 1970s and how much they changed young adult fiction and really how influential they were on me.
So
and
tell us about those books for people who don't know.
Well, Judy Blume's books, as many people, in the audience who are my age would know, dealt with topics that I think had never really been dealt with before. I think she was probably the first writer who had a main character who you read about when she got her period for the first time. It changed things forever, really, and I also wonder if there's anyone in this audience my age who didn't read Flowers in the Attic, which was really, and many people are laughing because you'll remember it was really, the main characters were a brother and a sister, in an incestuous relationship. So there's nothing that new about controversial topics, but I think those books actually did change things in new ways.
Indeed they did. In terms of the way that people responded at the time to, say, Flowers in the Attic, how would that book, if you overlay it to the predominant norms and prevailing culture of today, how would that book be received now? Would it have been a more tolerant response, or was it to what you had at the time?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, I think they wouldn't be as surprising. They wouldn't shock people in the same way. In other ways, perhaps, we're more judgmental and there are certain things that are more conservative now than in the 70s, I'm not sure.
Morris, you would have encountered a lot of that because you have been unafraid, a bit like Joe, to approach difficult topics. Do you think it's a more contested ground now than it might have been in the past in terms of dealing with difficult topics?
I think there's probably more anxiety in all of our lives about a whole range of things. And I think it's important to preface this discussion about taboos in children's books, because we will probably be saying some implicitly critical things of some of the judgments and positions that certain of our adult community have made. So I think it's important to preface it by saying that it's pretty hard to think about this whole area of taboos in children's books without it tapping into a significant area of adult anxiety. It's one of those examples where the lives of young people have injected into them adult anxiety. But adult anxiety, where children are concerned, most often comes from love. And it's worth remembering that, because some of the decisions and choices made around this area of taboos, we might feel they're misguided. We might feel that they are only a small slice of a bigger picture in terms of how stories work and what the benefits of stories are. But it's good to remember that parents are just trying to do their best in most cases. And yes, there's a fringe community in this debate of people who are driven not by love for children, but by ideology, religious or otherwise, and they perhaps are more worthy of our condemnation. And remind me to condemn them a bit later, if you would.
I won't forget, I tell you. In deciding what kids read, though, do we listen to children themselves? There's a lot of adult voices when it comes to discussing controversial books and whether kids should read them, but who's listening to kids in determining what children read?
It's a tricky one for me. My collection is used by researchers, not by children.
Yep.
So I think our publishers look for what will sell, and that has to be what children want to read. And in terms of this topic, when I looked into some controversial books that were banned or censored, it just seemed to me that it's human nature that that anyone would want to read something that someone says you shouldn't. So
So the best publicity is to be banned.
Yeah, well, in many ways. In fact, Philip Pullman's Dark Materials was roundly criticised, and it revealed, that criticism revealed an excellent series of books. So it did lift the profile of what was seen in some quarters as being controversial.
And the reaction to books and the banning of books has a lot of cultural overlay, which might change over time and does change over time. Have you got some examples of books that were banned centuries ago, or even in recent times, that might now seem for innocuous or strange reasons?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun researching this, actually. Good topic, Morris. Look, right back in the 16th century, in 1690, there was a book called the New England Primer, which the Puritans produced to ensure that the children in the new colony of Americas were educated. And so it had alphabets and it had lessons and that kind of thing. And the interesting thing is that in the first few editions, the alphabet had an explanation for you as being Uriah's beauteous wife caused David to take his life. And the thought is that that must have been quite a challenging subject for parents to explain as to why David coveted another man's wife. And in later editions, the explanation for you was just omitted and they went straight to V. So it's pretty kind of dramatic way to deal with it. And there are others. There are so many, actually. So, 19th century, not a book at the time that was greeted well is Little Black Sambo, and some of you may have seen the example that I had up in the exhibition. Little Black Sambo was written in 1899, and it uses the character's name. The boy is black, and the character's name is a term that was a derogatory term used to refer to black people from the 17th century onwards. Also, Sambo's parents were named Mumbo and Jumbo. And so the book today we would recognise as being very racist. But interestingly, in 1996, two African-American author and illustrator wrote back to that and joined the dialogue on racism in the original. So they wrote a book called Sam and the Tigers, and I had that in the exhibition as well. And Sam and the Tigers, the author was an American civil rights activist, and the illustrator is Jerry Pinkney, and he's a much acclaimed African-American artist. The story is, Sambo is changed to Sam, and Sam's parents' names are Sam and Sam, and it's set in an imaginary location called Sam Saram. It's the same story, and beautifully illustrated, and it is basically a hero story. But both the author and illustrator made the point that they actually liked Little Black Sambo when they read it. And I've had that on my desk for the last 2 weeks, and so many of my colleagues have walked past and said they really liked that book. And I think the thing for the African-American authors and illustrator was that they there weren't many picture books that had a black main character in it. And the main character is a hero, and he remains a hero in Sam and the Tigers. And it is an engaging story. So I thought that actually really dealt in a really bold way with something that we, see differently now. The racism in that 1899 book was confronted incredibly interestingly.
Maurice, you said that there aren't any universally taboo topics. How do you navigate that if there aren't any taboo topics? Are you saying that there's a way to approach every story and every issue with a sense of purpose and clarity that allows it to be discussed?
What I'm saying is that to attach taboos to subject matter is missing a lot of the points and doing a disservice to young people and their reading. There is a way of writing a story where you really take advantage of everything stories are capable of. Our young people live in a world where they can, of course, no longer be cotton-balled away from the many aspects of the world that cause us adults deep shame and unhappiness. We've bequeathed them a media-drenched world. They have an oblong in their hands that gives them the surface, at least, of the whole world. Our news services have been tasked for a couple of 100 years with delivering us a daily sequence of decontextualised examples of the very worst behaviour that we humans are capable of. Stories are capable of doing that. but contextualized, and to, at the same time, explore the very best that we humans are capable of and everything in between. So instantly, stories are able to achieve a balance that every journalist dreams of, but stories can really do it. And there's another component to stories. When a story has been read by a child for whom it has expanded horizons, it has confronted them with aspects of human behaviour and possibility that they hadn't encountered before. When a story has been life-changing, and every good story is, young people want to talk about it. Now, those parents who understandably sometimes channel their anxiety about their children not being harmed and, in fact, enjoying as many benefits in their young years as possible, when they channel those anxieties into a desire to remove certain subject matters out of the literature for young people, I try and encourage them, rather than to value remove, to value add by being available for the conversations that young people will want to have. Deeply invested though I am in an ego and a financial and many other ways in books and stories, I've come to believe that those conversations are as important as the books themselves. And it's a lucky young person who is able to, in a guided and partly self-selecting way, have reading adventures without limit, and has available an adult that loves or at least cares about them, available for these conversations. And the conversation is the second half of the book. A book is incomplete. A book for young people in particular is incomplete, I believe, without the conversation.
So the reading of the book is just the start.
Yeah.
Joe, you would have experienced this because your books have dealt with, say, the 9/11 attacks in the United States, and you've written material also dealing with the really difficult issue of sexual abuse. Challenging to actually meet the standard that Morris is talking about there, to navigate children through those really difficult experiences in a way that they feel both safe where they are and not frightened of the future. How do you strike that balance?
Well, I think there are two things I'd like to say about that. First of all, I suppose I would want to say that we're using children's literature as a kind of an umbrella term here. But really, when we're talking about picture books for very young children, or junior fiction, or young adult fiction, we may be talking about quite different things.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I would want to say about that. The second thing I guess I would want to say is I feel that there probably are no topics that are off limits. I can't much think of an actual topic that's off limits. But I would say that I might believe that children's books, more than adult fiction, need to be well written. So how the treatment of those topics might matter more actually for children's books than for adult fiction. I've seen some pretty poor versions of books on sexual child abuse and some amazing ones. I've seen some pretty crappy books on 9/11 and some fantastic ones.
Well, can I ask you about that? What would differentiate the two? So if there are universal themes, or is it a style of writing or a philosophy that's inherent in both the books that do add value and are substantive and the ones that fail?
Well, I think it's probably style of writing. I think, there is good writing and not such good writing in some ways. I think that really does matter. And I do think that, researching your topic, if a writer of books for young people is writing about a difficult topic, they better be right and knowledgeable about that topic they're writing on. So I think those things make a difference.
And to both of you as authors, the reaction you will get from children would vary significantly. How mindful of that, Morris, are you when you write these books? You are writing possibly a life-altering text for someone, and that comes with an enormous responsibility.
Absolutely. And I mean, what we've just heard is a very important thought, that children aren't obviously at the same point in their various developmental stages, at age 4 compared to 10 or compared to 15. And I think I write for young people from about 7 and up, but the age is less important than the stage they are in their lives. I write for young people who, hopefully through their early years, have had, they've been surrounded by caring adults who will supply them with all the information and some ready-made opinions and worldviews to help them start to navigate a sense of what the world's about. But for each of us, there is that magic time, I assume 7, 8, that sort of time, when we start thinking for ourselves, when suddenly we're starting to not just accept everything we're told, we're starting to make some of our own judgments. We're starting to, I guess, lay the foundation of our personal moral landscape. And for me, that is a precious window of only a few years where we are, in some ways, able to function at the pinnacle of our moral receptiveness because the hormones haven't flowed. The biological imperative, the delightful biological imperative, hasn't taken us in its grip. And whatever our path is in terms of children, families, whatever, regardless of that, the biological imperative grips us. And from the day it does, we spend the rest of our lives working, well, very distracted by the need to either strategize the possibility of behaving as if we're at least going to perpetuate our species, and for some of us, then living with the consequences forever of having done so. For those few years, those distractions aren't there. When a young person between, let's say, 7 and 11 sees some aspects of life that they want to explore further, they have the capacity to focus on it with every fibre of their being, undistracted. And I think it is an incredible privilege to work with young people at that age, because this is where the foundations of their real self is being laid, and who they are through the decades very much results in what's happened during those years. And I think the stories they read and the opportunities they have to open their minds to a whole range of aspects of human existence, the confronting, the dark, as well as all the most wonderful possibilities, they should all be in there, because we're going to expect our young people in another 10 or 15 years, it'll be their generation that will take over the reins of the world, faced by, I think it's reasonable to say, the biggest range of challenges that any human generation on a global scale has ever faced. They need to know the territory. They need to know the worst that their fellows are capable of, as well as the best. And to not equip them with that in a context where they can see how the two work together, and how the two are contained within each of us, and how an outbreak of either is something that is to a degree controlled by individual or by groups of people making decisions in society, politically. This sort of, if we slam the lid down on certain areas of the world that they inhabit and already know a fair bit about, in terms of seeing that adults prefer not to talk sometimes about certain topics, well, there's nothing more fearful than a young person to see that an adult they trust and love just doesn't want to talk about some aspect of life. That's monsters under the bed time.
Speaking of monsters under the bed, I mean, if you go back to Grimm's fairy tales, for instance, Juliet, you speak about the darkness in the human experience. If you read the original text of those, they are fairly confronting, aren't they? They're cautionary tales. I guess, were they written with the altruistic aim of keeping children safe from peril?
I think they're certainly cautionary tales and based on fear, and so that children should be, warned in a pretty graphic kind of way to be careful of certain areas. I might also say that the Grimm's fairy tales, the first edition from the first decade of the 19th century, is very different to the one that most people know. Yeah. So the 1850s is when the 7th edition, which is the one most people know, is very different. So the Grimm brothers collected stories from the middle class German population, and that first edition has some stories that have never been produced for children. And one of the titles, I think it is, how some children learnt to slaughter. And it's the most extraordinary story. And the
It's like a
children,
Quentin Tarantino film.
well, the children, briefly, the children do learn to slaughter a pig, but then one of the older boys also slits the throat of his younger brother, and the mother is so enraged by that she stabs him.
I wasn't joking.
And then she had left her youngest child in a bath, and the youngest child drowns in the meantime. So it's an amazing story.
So I just want to ask the authors here, what do you think the purpose of that text was, Boris?
Well,
Just hearing it.
I hadn't heard about that particular story, but it does make me think that maybe the Brothers Grimm were tasked with attempting to terrify children into being, well, in the words of our current Prime Minister, quiet Australians.
Others as well. That first edition, the mothers that were turned into stepmothers in later editions. So Snow White, it was her mother that tried to kill her through envy. In the first edition, in Hansel and Gretel, it was their mother that left them in the woods, not their stepmother. Cinderella, the stepmother was very jealous of Cinderella, and she encouraged her daughters, so Cinderella's stepsisters, to cut off their toes and their heels so that they would fit into the golden slipper. Really amazing stuff.
Actually, that story you just outlined, I mean, I think it's a great story, and it, even though I haven't read it, because your coverage, as they say in Hollywood, was superb, and you've sold it to me. And it's just about how it's about how violence is contagious. If once the slitting starts, people who were not previously engaged in any form of slitting are in there slitting away.
Maybe it's about that.
But it does raise the issue, I mean, of the function of fear in children's literature and how much is too much, and how you then, as I said a little earlier, make young people feel safe and optimistic about their future without sugarcoating the truth of experience and what the boundaries are around that. And Morris, having written those books about the Holocaust, no greater violent obscenity than that, how did you go about navigating that?
Well, I only have one absolutely immutable law, self-imposed, in my writing for young people, and that is that I will never write a story in which the young main character feels worse about themselves and their place in the world at the end of the story compared to how they did at the beginning. Now, that's a big claim when you're writing about something like the Holocaust, but it goes back to what I was saying before, that a story about even one of our darkest times can also be a story about friendship and love, about optimism and hope, and the capacity for creative thinking that young people have to, even in the midst of circumstances that look like they will almost certainly be calamitous, to still have the capacity to imagine futures and alternatives that are not calamitous. Somebody at a conference the other day just asked me what my simple definition of literature was, and I'd never really thought of it this way, but I suddenly realised that I think literature is anything that we can consume through our language that is dedicated wholly to opening up possibilities. And if it's dedicated or even seeking to close down any possibilities in the lives of young people, it's not literature and it's not helpful. And censorship is about closing down possibilities. And the use of fear to try and control and contain the inclinations of children, as has been used often in children's literature in times past, that is anti-literature. And for me, it's always risky to give sort of 5-word definitions of something like literature, but that sense, is it opening up the possibilities in the lives of young people? And this is certainly I don't think I've ever heard a young reader say, I really like this book because I feel it's opening up many possibilities in my life. But when they do talk about what they like about certain stories and why they want to keep reading certain types of books, it is clearly there as a subtext in what they're saying. It is because they're at a time in those golden years, thinking for themselves, not yet biologically oppressed. They are, their life for them is all about possibility. And it's a case of letting them explore as many during those undistracted years, I think.
But with the subject matter as profound as the Holocaust, did you get pushback from grown-ups who were saying writing about it for children in this way was trivialising it?
To a degree. I think most of the pushback came from adults who simply did not want kids to know about or have to connect in any visceral, emotional way with those terrible events, those terrible behaviours. There was a fear, I think, that of possible trivialisation.
What would you say to those that came to you and said, why are
Well,
you doing this?
Most of these expressed anxieties were from people who hadn't read the books. So I would say, I want to have a conversation about this, and I really respect, particularly if you're somebody who has a personal or family connection with those terrible events, or you've studied, you've taught, or even if you're just somebody who just thinks, no, this feels wrong. But we can't have the conversation until you've read the books. And I'm not quite sure how to say this in a suitably modest way, but very few of the people who've read the books wanted to come back and have the same conversation.
So the proof was in the reading. Cultural overlay is a big thing too, isn't it? Because your books about the September 11 attacks, still highly contested political and cultural area, still to today. So if you're writing from one perspective, whether it's a white Western perspective, what are you doing with the other perspective of what might be in that story too? And is cultural overlay and cultural assumption a real issue when it comes to writing for children?
Oh, I think it is a real issue. In terms of the September 11 books, it is true that most of the 120-odd books that were written for children about 9/11 were from the US. They were pretty nationalistic. They were... but as time went on, actually, they got more and more nuanced. So as time went on, there were children's books that were kind of lashing back against the perceived and Islamophobia and taking kind of a Muslim perspective and trying to do something more nuanced and careful with those as well. But kind of on that topic as well, prior to coming to La Trobe, I worked at QUT for a very long time. And for a period of time, I was teaching children's literature and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies. And the QUT library at one point went through their children's book collections, looking for books that really were outdated in terms of racist representations of indigeneity, etc. And that was a complex and interesting discussion, and we had many, many discussions along with the Indigenous unit at QUT around should these books be taken off the shelf, should they remain on the shelf but with caution, because otherwise what if somebody just picks them up and doesn't know that it's an outdated or racist representation and takes them in on prac and teaches them to kids as student teachers. So there are many interesting conversations that take place around these issues.
So we're constantly revising the cultural relevance of those texts and seeing them through our own lens. And is that appropriate? Might have dropped out.
Yeah.
Is that appropriate to do that, to look back through our own contemporary eyes at a text that was written at a different time for a different purpose?
I think it's a really interesting issue, Francis. There is a book called The Australia Book. It was published in 1952, and it is a white settler narrative about Australian history. And that was republished in 2008 with simply a preface to say that this is a classic of children's literature, implying recommendation, but it actually with a forward saying that values had changed, and the cover says a lot. So the cover is 4 lines of people moving from left to right across the cover, implying that the right-hand side is progress. That's what we aspire to. But on the top line, there are 2 figures that are stationary, looking back to the left, and half naked. So costume and transport are a way of sort of signifying, occupation on the cover. And those 2 characters looking back are Indigenous Australian. And I think the visual literacy of that cover says a lot about that white settler narrative. The fact that it was republished in 2008 with simply a preface, and I don't know that too many children read a preface, to say that we should make allowances for this previous kind of perceptions. I think if I go back to Sam and the Tigers, I would prefer to see a writing back to a book like that if it was going to be republished. So that you have that bold statement from an Indigenous Australian about, and we do get that in different ways, but not necessarily addressing the Australia book.
I imagine that given the contested ground over such texts, that would manifest itself often when it comes to school libraries and syllabuses for school different curriculum. Is that still going on, and is there still a form of book banning that goes on casually or sort of quietly in school libraries that does show that there are some things that remain taboo?
Absolutely. I think librarians are always making choices about what go on their shelves and what don't. Children's books are heavily mediated in a way that adult books are not. So, there are many, many people involved in producing a children's book. I think there's the author, but there's the publisher, and there's the editor, and there's the publicist, and there's the librarian, and there's the parent, and there's the teacher. So I guess that does make it more complicated because the book stands alone in one respect, but there are an awful lot of other people making decisions about whether they'll be read, how they're read, can they be read, whether there'll be conversation after they're read. So I think there's overt censorship, but there's also always, and always has been, I guess, and always is, there are other kinds of ways people decide what is read and what isn't read.
Maurice, have any of your books ever been subject to that sort of resistance in an educational setting?
Well, my book, 2 Weeks with the Queen, when it was first published in the UK, was published the same month that the Thatcher government amended the Local Government Act to say that, and bearing in mind that the system then, still largely now, was that money for school libraries, state school libraries, came via the local authority. So the Local Government Act was amended to say that no local government funds could be spent on anything at all that was, quote, promoting homosexuality in schools. And there was a flurry of legal advice which said if a book didn't overtly condemn homosexuality, it was open to being seen as promoting it. And my book, which has the young protagonist sent to England to be protected from the sadness of his younger brother's death from a serious illness, and he naturally goes to a cancer hospital to try and borrow a very good doctor to come back to Australia and save his brother, and he befriends a couple of gay men, one who's living and not happily with HIV/AIDS. So it was an obvious candidate for anxiety in the council chambers, and the book was removed from a lot of schools pretty much, the week it had been put in. And for me, that was brilliant because I was a new author, and I certainly was not known as a writer in the UK. And so a generation of young high school students got wind that there was a banned book still available in the bookshops down the corner. So instead of the book being, having 3 copies in a school library, some dozens of eager young transgressive students would go and buy it for themselves. That was perfect for me.
I'm sure it was.
So I'm all in favour of censorship, actually.
But there's a double standard at play, isn't there? Because parents do want their kids to be wise to the world, to be ready to take on the challenges, to be resilient, and to understand what it means to have to pick themselves up. But at the same time, they live in fear of certain topics in that are written.
I think really to answer your previous question more fully, there's a dynamic that every teacher, every school librarian, particularly in the state system, knows, and that is that the overly anxious parent, the most anxious parent in the class or the year, has great power, because if their anxiety causes them to really demand meetings and reports about a certain book, of course we know that all teachers in the state system and librarians are stretched to the absolute limit, and they just don't have time. So if they get, a book comes in and they see something on page 47 and they think, oh, the Jones family is not going to like that. And I use that name generically, it's not any specific Jones family. They're not going to like that. And they will sometimes save themselves and their colleagues from the extra hours of work that defending that book would involve.
So a form of self-censorship out of preservation, self-preservation.
Well, kind of, yes. And of course, their teaching standards suffer. They may well recognise this book has great value to be worked on, to be discussed with kids, and all the other kids in the class, including young Ms. or Mr. Jones, suffer as well.
We're talking then about the burden on teachers, and you talked about mediating the experience, and Morris talked about it as well, that the conversation at the end of the child reading the book is as crucial as the experience of reading in and of itself. So do you think teachers are equipped to be able to mediate those conversations? Are parents, and can we equip parents to do that? Do they need to go back to school?
Well, I think that's a serious question. I think some are and some aren't. And I'll just kind of mention a story some of you may know, and I think this took place in London, and not long ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, there was a teacher who was fired because, and she had, well, in my mind, well, I'll just kind of put it out there and ask whether it was responsible or irresponsible, but she was teaching, actually I think she was teaching Macbeth, so it wasn't a children's book as such, but it was being used as a children's book. And she gave the assignment to students that they should go home and write the suicide note that Lady Macbeth would have written before she killed herself. So she got in an awful lot of trouble. So I think for me, that's a kind of an interesting example of, how serious in some ways the question is. I don't have an answer about whether they're all prepared or not, but it's an interesting, example.
Because Morris, you are going around and on your travels talking in that environment. Do you talk to teachers about how they can deal with difficult texts after the kids have read them and explore the themes and try to guide their students through the experience in a way that enriches their lives?
I don't talk to teachers so much about that, because my sense is that teachers, and in particular that most precious of all literary resource, the teacher librarian, and full librarians, they know this, and that is one of the very special and unique things they have to offer in the school system, and it's why it's such a tragedy when very well-meaning but slightly misguided principals decide to redeploy those financial resources elsewhere. I do talk to parents, I talk to policymakers and purse string holders, the sort of people who make decisions that affect large numbers. This is not something that I've done just as part of being a children's author. It's because I've had this role of children's laureate for the last couple of years, and these are very important conversations to have. But what I'm finding very often is that they quickly come back to a restating of what stories are and why they're important, and why these topics, isolated and just pulled out of the process of a good story, are kind of missing the point, because in a nutshell, young people's stories are actually very traditional. They've escaped that overlay of all of the intellectual games that adult fiction has been prey to at a literary level sometimes for the last decades. Kids' stories are really about a young character with a huge, inescapable, urgent problem, and to have a chance of surviving, let alone solve it, they need to develop a whole range of personal capacities: information gathering and management and analysis, the ability to form allegiances with people that they might not otherwise do that because they need the help. So there's all sorts of social skills and empathy, and they need to, for the first time perhaps in their young lives, think about what is a problem-solving strategy, and what resources do I need, and what creative thinking do I need to get a problem-solving strategy together. And finally, they can, around page sort of 57, they can unleash it on that problem, and then they discover that because they are the main character in a piece of long-form fiction, and their friend, their guide, their advocate, their author is contracted to write 250 pages, that is never going to work, that problem-solving strategy. And so they learn failure and despair and shame, and they learn they can survive it, and that there are useful bits of information when you look back at that failure, when you go on and build your next problem-solving strategy. Now, these are so fundamental to the key developmental stages that we would want every young person to benefit from, and they are so, the energy of the story is about young people, even if the problems are too big for them to solve, assuming that they survive. And I don't really see much point in writing a story where the main character is killed before the end of the story.
Oh, the Grimms didn't get that memo.
No. The Grimms, though, I think the Grimms maybe saw children as a little bit more disposable for a greater purpose than I certainly do. And I don't mean, I say that fondly because, there are authors whose family name begins with G as well. They share my shelf. So I feel sort of, a collegiate approach to them as well.
In the long history of children's literature that you are the guardian of, do you see those themes that Morris talked about there running deep? Or is it more of a more recent construction as we've sort of built a version of childhood that is a product of our affluence, that we can allow our children to explore that space in a way that maybe other children... And I think there's a class element too as well. So when I was growing up, there were no books to read for pleasure. I grew up in a Housing Commission house where I learnt to read so that I might be able to get a job. There wasn't a book to read. My parents didn't read for pleasure. They left school when they were, in grade 4 and 5. So
I think in the second half of the 20th century, we're seeing a greater diversity of subjects being written about, and different perspectives on a whole range of things. And I guess, in terms of banned books, often topics or often the complaints are around language used, vulgar language used, sex and sexuality, and violence in children's books. And I think, as Morris has just explained, it depends on how that is handled. But also, from what Joe was saying about librarians and school teachers, that there is a way to kind of confront a lot of the objections that are made to some controversial books. And since the 1980s, the American Library Association has had a banned book week in September annually. And they would look at all of the books that had been banned across America that year and discuss them. So it brings that discussion onto another level. It's almost a lobbying against censorship. And it is also where some fantastic writing has been revealed. Morris's example in England is, it's an uncovering of fantastic writing in a different field or a different readership. So I think in many ways banning books works against the people that try and ban them. But I do certainly appreciate that teachers and librarians are put in awkward positions, very awkward positions at times.
If I am allowed to just add to that, PEN has also defended children's writers over the years, and something we haven't mentioned at all today is illustration. So we probably shouldn't be talking about children's books without also talking about the pictures and the illustrations alongside them. But PEN defended, and some of you might remember this one too, and I think I bought it for my kids, a book, a sex education book called It's Perfectly Normal. Probably some people in here. But it had quite graphic illustrations, like naked, adults making love. And it was banned from many libraries, but PEN defended it and gave it, and I think it won a humanitarian award.
And we're about to throw the microphone to you for your questions, but I just want to finish up here with you, Morris, and just ask, you've been writing children's literature for 3 decades or more now. There are now many adults in the world who read your books as children. You must hear amazing stories about how your books have changed the course of their life. Give us a sense of what that's like when someone does tell you that they read a book of yours and their perspective on the world has changed.
Well, I certainly get a lot of young readers at my signing table now with tattered first editions of my early books, and I say, oh, I've already signed it. Yes, they say, you signed it for my mum when she was in year 4. And that's a wonderful thing, not just in an ego sense, but it's so good to see that there are families who have their own literary traditions within the family. Doesn't matter if it's my books or other books. And yes, I have many conversations, and I get much communication from people who talk about life-changing books, and yes, there's a personal gratification in that, but it's also fantastic ammunition, I guess, for those of us who want to remind the larger adult population that stories are a very important part of young people's lives, and that this question of taboos should really be looked at intent and the effect, the complete effect that a piece of reading will have on young people. And I mean, we haven't really touched yet tonight on some other taboo areas, such as the huge number of books for young people written purely as merchandising exercises to sell merchandise that has spun out of a video game or a movie or even a series of books. But the intent and the purpose of these stories is to take what should be sacred aspects of a young person's journey and the opening of their mind and the developing of their aspirations and goals, and seeking to fulfill some of what should be these open-ended journeys with products. You go to the Bologna Book Fair, which is the big international book fair for children's books, and there are hundreds, thousands of publishers there, and you realise that more than 50% of the children's books published in the world are not published for the good of children, they are published for the good of a merchandising marketing exercise. And that, I think we should be looking at the taboo aspects of that. Not that I'm saying they should be censored, but if we, I often invite indignant and overwrought, over-anxious parents. I say, look, if you really, want a useful channel for your indignation, and I'm just taking a name at random, I think maybe the Disney Corporation, rather than some piece of human anatomy that, frankly, half of the population didn't choose to have. Let's get over it.
And on that note, we will throw it over to you. So if you've got a question for any of our panellists, please stick your hand in the air, stand up, introduce yourself, and keep your questions brief and direct, and we'll see if we can find an answer for you. So,
hi, thank you for extremely informative talk. I very much agree that no subject can be taboo, and you touched on, but I'd love you to expand a bit, if that's okay, on subjects not being taboo, but the way they're written about, and for the level of maturity of a young reader. Personal problem is my 9-year-old is obsessed with Holocaust literature, and I'm constantly reading everything before she does. Sometimes, very rarely do I say no, don't read it, but occasionally I'm really conflicted, and I'm happy to have the discussions, but there are some graphic details. So obviously everyone's different. Obviously lines need to be drawn that need to be wavy, not straight. But how do we guide our young people to make the right choices in their literature?
I'd go back to something I said before about having conversations, and I'm absolutely certain you already have conversations with your daughter about her reading, but I guess as a parent, if one of my kids had developed a really strong, even slightly obsessive focus, as you've suggested, on any one area of human life as portrayed in children's books, I would be wanting to try and explore what it is that what is making her want to focus on that area, what she's getting from it. She's obviously getting things from it, and your judgments about whether how you might intervene and in what way and to what degree, I think would be really best informed by trying to get to know her side of this equation rather than focusing on the fact that it's the Holocaust. And I apologise if I'm sort of telling you something that you already perfectly well know and are doing.
Thank you. I had a question. You were saying about the conversations and how important they are. And it was the same principle behind Sesame Street. You had the adult and you had the Muppets to build that conversation. Would you consider making your own podcast with the children reading the book?
Yeah, look, I think podcasts are wonderful. I use them a lot, and I have thought that I'd really like to do some podcasts at some stage. And I hang up my ermine-trimmed Laureate robes in December, and next year is when I get to go back to my writing desk and pursue a few other projects that I've been thinking about. So I'll get you just to sign a release form afterwards that I can pursue that without any financial obligations to you. But thank you for suggesting it.
Is that the most rewarding part of your experience, though, Morris, is when children speak to you about your books and give you their version of what they think they've experienced?
Children are wonderful to write for because they, up to a certain age, up to the age where they are still, where they are not yet self-conscious, and it's to do with that, those hormones, they've got so much to answer for. They are so direct and so open, and that is what every author would want from readers, with no overlay of wanting to make the conversation either more about the person's sense of their social selves or fulfilling some kind of obligation to show due respect to an author and not. Kids are just in there, and if it's Morris, why was your latest book not as good as some of your earlier ones?
I like your old stuff better than your new stuff. There's a bit of that.
I'm using that as a generic, for instance. I'm not saying anybody's ever said that or had cause to. Please understand.
I wanted to know, movies have age ratings, and as a teacher it can be incredibly hard. Like, I almost wish there was some sort of online site for, turn to page X for the very worst page that you're going to get pulled up by a parent for, because it's so, I'd love to have the time to read every book in the library, but I don't. So what is your viewpoint on, should books come with either an age range? I know that sometimes, it does say may contain, but, every TV show we watch comes with a contains sexual language, may contain violence, and yet books don't. So what's your viewpoint, and what's the way forward on that one?
Joe, because we spoke about this earlier in the week about, writing for different levels of experience for children at different ages.
So I think Morris is right. It's not as much about age ranges as levels of maturity. But when we did our research on picture books about child abuse, we then donated all those picture books to the Abused Child Trust Fund, and again had a lot of discussions around whether they should all have labels on them about who they could be used for and what kind of age, and with an adult or without an adult, and how that adult should be prepared. So I think we felt that those things were probably a good idea, but it's very difficult to determine who exactly should read what book.
There's another question from over on my left-hand side.
Hi, my name's Emma, and I recently read the Holocaust series with my daughter. I read each one after her, which I was a bit nervous about, but she was fine with that. She's 12, just turned 13. And I'm wondering if you think that the kids maybe naturally filter, like self-filter some of the information, and how deliberate that might be in your storytelling. And I'm thinking specifically of the part where it's Zelda and the woman who was looking after her are hanged in the town square, and there's no, you don't say they're hanged. I think you said they were swinging, something like that. And I still don't know. I mean, my daughter knew they were dead, like by the end of the story, but I still don't know if she actually understood what happened and that didn't bother her, or whether maybe she just on some level, sort of blocked that out and was quite happy to go on with the story. So I wondered whether that's maybe a bit deliberate, and what you think of that idea that children might be able to just take what they want.
Well, I guess I should preface my response with the words spoiler alert, somewhat...
Bit late.
Somewhat belatedly, yes, absolutely. No, please. I didn't realise this until a couple of years after I finished the first book, but I actually realised then that I had included in the story a demonstration of the way young people do filter and protect themselves through their management of their perceptions. Young Felix, at the beginning of the first book, runs away from the orphanage. He's been hidden in by his parents. He doesn't know there's a war on. He doesn't know the implications. There is a slow growing of dread as he sees certain things that this might have had terrible implications for his parents. But he brings a lot of creative thinking. Blood in a river is because there must be rabbit shooters up the river, etc., etc. And slowly, and some of the Year 7 and 8 readers of this book are infuriated by how dumb Felix is, that he can't, wake up and smell the whatever. And but there's a purpose to it, although I wasn't wholly conscious of it at the time. And from the many conversations I've had with readers of this particular group of books, say from age 8 and up, I wrote them first person so that it would be a journey of discovery for young readers about some of these terrible aspects of human behaviour, seen totally through the eyes of a 10 and then 11 and then 12-year-old boy. And it did allow me to not have to portray the whole canvas in detail, but and I also felt a great responsibility not to shy away from the truths and realities, but I was able to do it through Felix's perceptions in a way that that young readers can take from it what's appropriate to them. The books are often used in middle and upper primary, and then again in lower secondary, and I've spoken to lots of Year 7 and 8 students who've gone back to these books for a second time, and who are able to be quite articulate in telling me what they have taken from the books at age 14 compared to what they took at age 8 or 9. It's I guess I should write sort of an article about that, because that's actually very reassuring to parents and teachers who might be concerned that the subject matter alone is a reason for anxiety.
Great question. We've got some more questions. Stick your hand up so we can see it in the middle row here.
While the mic's being passed across, can I just ask, are there any lawyers here tonight? Because if there are, I'd just like a quick word afterwards about how I can communicate as quickly as possible to the Disney Corporation in Southern California that I was referring to the Disney Corporation in Carnegie, that really small one. They're the ones exploiting young children with merchandising. I just need some advice how to write that letter.
I wanted to ask that when we think about taboo, we often think about more progressive topics like LGBT equality or racial equality or feminism, but we're also in a world where there's a growing alt-right and there's a growing white supremacist movement, and that movement does include books and children's books. As I'm a teacher and as a librarian or as a teacher, how do we deal with that? Because while we don't want to be accused of censorship, we also don't want to be accused of promoting racism or promoting homophobia at the same, or we don't want not to be accused of that. We don't want to do that. So how do we deal with that moving forward?
So when the books don't accord to our own values, what do we do?
Well, can I say that some of those 9/11 books are pretty right-wing, the world is good and evil, we white Americans are good, there's evil out there, though, that we must protect ourselves from. I mean, quite a lot of those books were that. And I might just mention that I had a book contract with a Brazilian colleague. We'd written the whole book on children's books about terrorism, and at the very last moment, the publisher withdrew the offer to publish the book, and it was never published because it was too political. They told us it was too political, and they didn't agree with the politics. And we'd written the whole book with a contract, and it didn't ever get published.
I would say that the more a young person has the opportunity to read stories that are about opening up, including the possibilities of their own judgment and their own response on a moral and other level to what's going on in the story, the more they read those sorts of stories, the more they will spot the stories that are actually trying to close down possibilities of response and channel the response into one particular ideologically driven channel. And that's not the entire answer. I mean, I've often talked with young people about a really simple little formula that is always useful to apply to any story, whether it be purporting to be literature or whether it is openly marketing. The Nike Corporation had a beautiful short story, a very skillful, not necessarily the great intent short story written many years ago, 3-word short story, just do it. Many, many possible meanings to that story. And my little equation is 3 questions. Who is telling me this story? Why are they telling me this story? What does this story really mean? Now, there's not necessarily only one answer to each of those questions, but that is an interesting little thought exercise to apply, because even if if a young person's reading experience doesn't immediately alert them to the shameless use of, say, a tragedy like 9/11 to simply push a particular narrow ideology, applying that little equation or formula will perhaps help tease out some other questions that need to be asked about books like that. And this is absolutely not this notion of using what should be an opening up process, story for narrow channels. The far left do it as well. You know, we have to say that the enemies here aren't either the right or the left. The enemies are people who misuse stories.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying about it's how the story is told. And obviously, I'm a children's librarian. We don't want to be censors, and we want freedom of ideas, and we want children to be able to challenge ideas. But where the complexity comes in is where, or one of the complexities comes in, is when you're talking about very young children. Because I deal mostly with early childhood. I read a lot of the older books, but mostly our customers are younger. And when you're looking at propaganda texts, which are directed at 3 to 7-year-olds, and that is where we need to actually take the really serious task on of the complexity of we want to not be censoring things, but the fact that when we're talking about very, very young audiences, that we are curating the world that they're presented with, and that they don't have the capacity for the critical engagement that older children do, because they're actually learning about the world and taking things in the way that developmentally is suitable for them at that age. And I think we need to start to wrestle with that difficulty. How would you advise that we, as a Children's Laureate, that we take on those questions about how to deal with, for example, nihilism sold to very young children, or all the kinds of hopelessness that we can see in text design for very, very young children.
In text design?
Oh, for example, in picture books.
Yeah. Well, look, I agree with the thoughts that you've just expressed. I mean, with children below a certain age, we have agreed as a society that they deserve intervention that we wouldn't see as appropriate at an older age, because they do sometimes need to be protected from forces that are way beyond their capacity in terms of where they're at developmentally and in terms of world experience. To even, a 3-year-old is not capable of saying, who is telling me this story, why are they telling it, what does this story really mean? And then we need to step in ourselves with those sorts of questions.
Hi, I'm Elliot, and I was just wondering which book that you've written is your favourite, and why? Well,
Elliot, I'm delighted to see you here this evening. You were at a school I was at this afternoon, and I noticed that that we sadly ran out of time for questions, and I knew you had a question that there wasn't time to answer, and the fact that you have tracked me down here in the State Library, if I needed any evidence for the resilience, for the imaginative thinking, for the determination and the bravery that a diet, as I know you have, a rich diet of varied reading of stories in the childhood produces, Elliot, Exhibit A, if only Radio National listeners could see Elliot in all his developmental and literary glory. Your question, Elliot, is the only question I could ever be asked as an author that I can't answer, because I have a very real friendship with each of my main characters. It stays with me forever after the books are published. And so for me to be asked to name a favourite character or book, they're pretty much synonymous, it's like if I say to you, Elliot, you've got a great group of friends, but tell me, just between you and me, who's your favourite, who's the best? We don't like to talk about that sort of thing in public, at least not, perhaps at our birthday when we see what they've given us, but apart from that, we don't. We don't. And so you've put me in a difficult position here, because I stand here as testament to openness and conversation, and I'm saying to you, Elliot, I'm not going to answer that.
We could throw the question back to you, Elliot. What's your favourite and why?
Probably Gift of the Gab or Once or Then.
Good on you, Elliot. 3 plugs on the ABC. You're my kind of reader.
I think on that note, have we got any more questions from the audience? It's going to be hard to top Elliot, so give us your best.
Yeah, it's not as good as your question, sorry. When you're writing about factual events, how do you balance the kind of creativity with the real life events? So, for example, I'm reading your book with my class Boy Overboard, so which bits are obviously based on truth and which bits are story? Because I can tell them a million facts, but they'll read your book and remember what you've said. So do you kind of have a rule when you're writing a story, this % fact and this % fiction? How do you work it out?
Well, with a book like Boy Overboard, and indeed the Once series, one obviously feels a huge sense of responsibility when you know that your fiction, with some made-up components, the characters, for example, not being portrayals of real, actual people, but you are drawing on the real, actual experiences of huge numbers of people who, unlike an author who chooses to write a story, they didn't choose to be involved in those real-life stories, and so you've raised something that is absolutely central to an author's thinking at this time. In Boy Overboard, I would say that all of the major incidents are representations of actual incidents that in my research I found had actually happened. But they are expressed through the perceptions and the feelings and the individual personality of the main character, and to a certain extent other characters. So there is an element of fiction as well, because I'm an author who did sort of third-party research and used my imagination to try and get as close as I could for my readers to some experiences that I've never had myself in exactly the ways that the people whose experiences inspired my writing had. So it's an imperfect science, just as this is an imperfect answer. But I think the attempt to honour the truths of the people who had those experiences, and nothing I've written has made this more of a significance for me than writing about the Holocaust. I think one does one's best. In the Once series, I went one step further. I used the word once for the title because to me it evokes both reality, these terrible things happened once, and it also invokes the tradition of story, once upon a time. And I start each chapter with that same word. But also I put an author's note in the back where I basically said, I write stories. These are stories. I've been inspired by some of what I think are the biggest and most important human events of the last century, but they're stories. And I hope that every one of you who has connected in a meaningful way with these stories will make this just the beginning, because there are the real voices, the real stories. Here in Melbourne, there is the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Elstonwick. There are still real-life Felixes, people who were 10 and 11 in the 1940s, Jewish survivors. They're there. They're prepared to talk to our young people. And there are archives. There's Spielberg's Shoah project. There are huge archives around the world where one can encounter the real voices. And my great hope was, and purpose really, was that these books of mine would just serve as a starting point, as a jumping off point for people to connect as deeply as they are able and want to with the real stories, the real history.
And that's where we'll finish this particular edition of the Bold Thinking series. Can you please give a big round of applause to our panellists? Juliet O'Conor, Joe Lampert, and Maurice Gleitzman. Thank you for your contributions to the floor with your questions. Don't forget, Radio National has recorded this session for its Big Ideas program, so check your guides for when that's going to air, and we look forward to having that on their podcast as well. Our next event is in the series is coming up on Wednesday, the 25th of September. Generational Divide. What kind of drinker are you? Young people are drinking less while boomers are hitting the bottle hard behind closed door. We're going to explore the function of alcohol in contemporary society. And what sort of trends are emerging, and talk about our drinking habits. That's coming up on Wednesday the 25th of September at the Clemenger Auditorium at the National Gallery of Victoria. And on Tuesday the 17th of September, a really fascinating forum on the issue of climate change in Australia. Where to now? A conversation with Bob Brown, Dr David Ritter, Dr Amanda Cahill and student Maisha Moyin, moderated by Professor Katie Holmes. That's also at the Clemenger Auditorium at the National Gallery of Victoria, Tuesday the 17th of September. Thank you for being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Bold Thinking series event.